партии отчизны в огне борьбы на стыке двух миров, чтоб всех людей дорогой новой жизни вести в свою октябрьскую ночь. Ты наш маяк, ты наше вдохновение, ты сила вся, которая в нас есть. Победы всей Родины свершения придрижены тобой КПСС. Слава, слава партии свободы, счастья, мира и труда. Ты вела и сквозь невзгоды, лишь к победам нас всегда, лишь к победам нас всегда. Глядим вперед грядущего вершины, уже не мысль сверкающая яд, и так для нас, трудящихся, решила добро и свет творящая моя. Как шар земной в пространстве может мчаться в созвучии лишь космических орбит, так на земле есть истинное счастье, лишь только то, что партия творит. Слава, слава партии свободы, счастья, мира и труда. Ты вела и сквозь невзгоды, лишь к победам нас всегда, лишь к победам нас всегда. Счастья, мира и труда. Ты вела и сквозь невзгоды, лишь к победам нас всегда, лишь к победам нас всегда, всегда, всегда.
пустяк, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Неба милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
И он продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И вновь снегопад
І зменююся бройний стражарет, і зменююся век і поколення. І зменююся бройний стражарет, і зменююся век і поколення. Цвете красный посвод, и дым веет над бульвара. Наш Ленин мирно Христа заход, и зменююся век и поколення. Наш Ленин мирно Христа жарет, и зменююся век и поколення.
At the call of Comrade Lenin, there arose the partisan. Through the winter's cold and famine, from the fields and from the towns. At the call of Comrade Lenin, there arose the partisan. At the call of Comrade Lenin, there arose the partisan.
भूख सर्दी मौत से लड़कर, गाँव और शहर से होकर, कॉमरेड लेनिन के आह्वान चले मुक्ति सेना दल। कॉमरेड लेनिन के आह्वान चले मुक्ति सेना दल। भूख सर्दी मौत से लड़कर, गाँव और शहर से होकर, कॉमरेड लेनिन के आह्वान चले मुक्ति सेना दल। कॉमरेड लेनिन के आह्वान चले मुक्ति सेना दल।
They destroyed the White Guard forces and to hell the bandits they hurled, and on Pacific Ocean the workers' flag unfurled, and on Pacific Ocean the workers' flag unfurled.
नरक के द्वार पे भाई दुश्मन के हर दस्ते शान सागर के ऊपर लहराए लाल झंडे शान सागर के ऊपर लहराए लाल झंडे नरक के द्वार पे भाई दुश्मन के हर दस्ते शान सागर के ऊपर लहराए लाल झंडे शान सागर के ऊपर लहराए लाल झंडे.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. It's a special edition of the program we regularly do today, in that it is, of course, the centenary, the 100-year anniversary of the death of the man known to the world as Lenin, but whose birth name, of course, was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, 1870 to 1924. And he is the man, if we can place the responsibility, of course, for an entire century or more on one man, but he is the man credited with the inspiration of and the organization of the October Revolution, the creation of the Soviet Union, the world's first workers and peasant state, the world's first state that abolished capitalist exploitation within its borders, the inspiration for the revolutions that were to follow across the world, most prominently, of course, in China, and the long independent struggles of the colonized peoples of places like India, of course, very famously, but also Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Algeria, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, South Africa, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and of course places like Congo, places like Cuba and the Cuban Revolution, to this day multiple places in South America. There is probably not any single figure who is not a featured prophet or messiah in the ancient books of the Abrahamic faiths, or those from the Eastern world, who unite so many people around the world, as Lenin's memory has done today, in bringing them together and declaring that his ideas are immortal and will guide us into the next revolution. And the influence of Lenin is, of course, over the last 100 years on a par with any of the holy characters featured in the Abrahamic faiths. So here we are, 100 years since the death of Lenin, and it's an interesting time to be a Marxist-Leninist, given the states of class struggle, both nationally and internationally. And I'm thinking back to the 90th anniversary of Lenin's death 10 years ago, and I think, as I was a Trotskyite at the time, we let it pass almost without comment, as far as I can remember, which is remarkable, really, considering that the whole thing that the Trotskyites is to claim to be more Leninist than Leninists. But on the 100th anniversary, everybody who claims even the vaguest lineage from Lenin's thought and life will, of course, want to say something. Now, what I have chosen to do today is to try to find a way to sum up the contribution of the man. And I think that there is no better way to do that than to examine, if not his greatest work, then I would argue his most foundational work, which is What Is to Be Done. Of course, taken from a title originally used by the Russian writer and revolutionary in his own right, Chernyshevsky, from a much earlier work. But I believe that What Is to Be Done and the legacy that it created and the practices that it created are perhaps the foundation upon which all of the rest of Lenin's thought is built. When I originally looked to do this program, I thought I was going to do a little bit on party organization, a little bit on Lenin's work on imperialism, perhaps some on Lenin's work on the national question. But then I thought that that would be too brief an overview. I think that the work, What Is to Be Done, is the cornerstone upon which everything else rests. Because for what reason did Lenin fundamentally need to study and rethink the question of imperialism? He needed to rethink that because of the colossal acts of betrayal that the Second International carried out in 1914. In August and September of 1914, as each of the Second International parties, each of the major Second International parties, followed their own ruling classes, declared allegiance to their ruling classes, and supported the German, French, British, Belgian, etc., or Italian in some cases, such as a certain Signor Mussolini, ruling classes into their imperialist wars of conquest. And of course this caused Lenin principally, but others as well, to have to re-examine everything. And when re-examining the nature of imperialism, of course Lenin writes imperialism the highest stage of capitalism, which is an immense contribution in and of itself. But one of the principal reasons why he had to re-examine imperialism and reconsider it all over again was because of the betrayals of the Second International and the growth of the aristocracy of labor, whose privileges were linked to the expansion of British or German or French imperialism, as foreseen, by the way, in some respects, by such an open and honest imperialist as the man who gave his name for a long time to a country, that of Cecil Rhodes, Rhodesia as it was formerly called, Zimbabwe now. Rhodes, before Lenin was writing this, I believe in the 1890s, made a comment that for the British state to continue, it would have to invest heavily in imperialism in order to make concessions to certain elements within the working class for the purposes of securing stability. And Rhodes was, if nothing else, a man with a good degree of foresight with regard to that particular question. And Lenin's research confirmed that this is indeed what all of the imperialist countries were doing. The growth of the labour aristocracy was, of course, in some respects, a deliberate choice by the ruling classes, and a very successful one, in that they effectively bought off the leading layers of the workers' movement and won them over to the side of imperialism, leaving the workers leaderless when it came to the outbreak of the first great imperialist war. So to combat, of course, the tendencies that grew to become the grotesque, opportunist, social chauvinist and social imperialist formation that the Second International became, one needs, of course, a better understanding of party organization. And that is what you find in What Is to Be Done. It is the starting point of Lenin's relentless battle with opportunism in all its forms, both its right opportunist form in the manner of what was to become the Soviet revisionists later on, and the Second International Bernstein advocates in the pre-World War I era, but also ultra-left dogmatism, as exemplified and critiqued by Lenin in his book Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. And it is in this book, What Is to Be Done, that he starts to talk about and analyze the problems of both right opportunism and left-wing dogmatism. And it is here from which a lot of the theories that define the rest of Lenin's work, and not just intellectual work, but practical work in the real political sense, come from. And so I think that on the centenary of his death, it is only appropriate to consider what is to be done and to talk about it for the next hour or so, and to see if, looking at it again, we can learn something. And that is, of course, what Lenin emphasized to all his comrades, that if you finish one book, pick up another one, and that you should never stop studying. You should, as a revolutionary, you should never stop studying, you should never stop learning. And it is the central point that perhaps we wish to drum home to people through doing all these streams. The study of Marxism, not just in a dry and academic fashion, but the study of the texts of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, and many others, is there not to learn and repeat dry formulas or natty phrases, but it's there to help you study and study again the method of Marxism-Leninism and to be able to apply it properly in your own context. And Stalin makes an observation, or made an observation, towards the end of his life, and it was him expressing a worry over the course of that was being taken by the Communist Party leadership that was surrounding him, which is that he observes in a note that he made about when he was reviewing the official USSR book on political economy, he observed that the earlier Bolshevik leaders in the pre-revolutionary period and immediately afterwards not only studied Marx and Engels, but studied them to the point where they would test each other on them. They would constantly question each other about it. They would always be seeking to go back to text they'd already read and learn more, learn about it all over again. And he observed that through the second and then in the third generations of the Soviet leadership, that this practice had died off for some entirely understandable reasons, some not so understandable. And that this lack of theoretical investigation, the lack of revolutionary theory to guide the practice, was going to have potentially devastating impacts upon the CPSU and the country itself. And Stalin was proved correct about that, as Molotov later observed in his sort of semi-autobiography. By the time of Stalin's death, none of the Politburo read anything anymore, and none of them actually studied the works of Marx or Engels anymore. And so by the time you get to like the fifth and the sixth generation of the Soviet leaders, people like Gorbachev, they haven't even read party brochures on the works of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. Never mind Stalin, who was of course persona non grata by then. What they'd read was sort of books of micro quotes. And that's the scope of the knowledge of people like Gorbachev or Yakovlev, or even some of their sometime opponents, such as Ligachev. They hadn't read these works, they hadn't studied them, they had no real revolutionary theory, they were just opportunists by that stage. So without constant reinforcement through study, opportunism is easy to slip into. Right, before we get to the things I wanted to talk about with regards to what is to be done, let's run through those who are in the chat tonight. So we have Banana Bender, good morning to you on the other side of the world and already in the middle of the work, or the early part of the working week. Red Star Betty, good evening to you from a stormy Durham. Excuse me. Rianne, evening all from Wales. Long live the spirit of Lenin. Indeed. Good evening to Lee. And good evening to Jerry in stormy Hampshire, who was just listening to the Clash's song Call Up. Well, if they try and call up anybody in this country, it's not going to go well. Rob, good evening to both you and Beans over there on the other side, or perhaps the wrong side of the Pennines. Good evening to C. Bolt and President Jesus, who says good afternoon. And Peter, hello to you in Perfidious Albion. Todd, good afternoon to you in New Mexico. Ali Abduni, good afternoon to you down there in Brazil. And Carmo, who comes to us from a very wet and windy Wirral. Try saying that 3 times quick when you're drunk. Terry, my comrade from the Class Consciousness Project, good evening to you. Zim Left Radio. Yes, there is a playlist available, as I said in my comment in the chat. If you want to receive a CD with some of these songs that I've been using on the introductions to these streams, send an email to the following address, editor@marksengelsinstitute.org, and when I've got things sorted out, I'll be able to mail you one out. So if you want one of these, be sure to email me. Right, Zim Left Radio. Yeah, that answers your question. Makumi, good evening to you in Nairobi. Lenin is eternal. He is indeed. Irish Partisan, good evening to you over there in Minsk. I see there was a celebration of Lenin by the Belarusian Communist Party in the middle of Minsk today. Steve Fred Johnson said, it is very good to be a part of this program. We're in a new stage of the world today, and programs such as these take on more importance. We urgently need to study and apply Marx, Engels, and Lenin. We do indeed, in order to build a movement and organization for the victory of the international working class and the defeat of the international capitalist class. Very well said, Steve. Nadia, good evening to you. And Martin, who says, revolutionary greetings to all the comrades from the deep south USA. That is from the south to all comrades in the struggle. Good evening to you, Martin, down there in the south of the Mason-Dixon line, is it? Banana Bender says, part of my family came to Russia because of Catherine the Great and were lucky enough to leave before Makhno came through the area in which they resided. He was a barbarian. Glad Lenin won. Yeah. Makhno, if you're not familiar with him, Nestor Makhno is a myth. He's a myth perpetuated by anarchists. The idea that he was the great leader who was going to lead Russia, though he was mostly active in what's now Ukraine, into a great stateless society. In reality, he was a bandit who carried out anti-Semitic pogroms with about as much enthusiasm as the White Russians did. So he was a scumbag leading a bandit army who periodically gibbered something about anarchism, and much like with Bakunin, the anarchists are prepared to overlook the reality and embrace the fantasy. And just in passing, Bakunin, by the way, supported the Confederacy in the American Civil War. Marx and Engels supported the Union side. So Bakunin, aristocrat, degenerate, pro-slavery. Makhno, bandit, anti-Semite. If he was around today, he'd be fighting with the Kiev regime. No doubt. Right, as many anarchists are, by the way. From anarchism to fascism is a very quick pipeline. Is Maison or ML Maoism inferior to ML, or is it just a different approach to a different context? Environment. You mean Maoism? Asks Banana Bender. Maoism depends what you mean by it, without wanting to sound like I'm copping out of the question. Look, there's Mao Zedong Fort, which recognizes the contributions made by the great Chairman Mao, all the way through the Revolutionary War, all the way through the beginnings of the New Democracy, the People's Democratic Dictatorship period, and in the Cultural Revolution, which I maintain was a great and heroic event, despite the fact that it ultimately ended in failure. That will cause controversy with some of the Dengists in the chat, perhaps. But I maintain that it is only the success of the Cultural Revolution that stopped a collapse of Gorbachev-like proportions in 1989 in the Tiananmen crisis. But Mao Zedong fought is a perfectly valid expression of trying to bring together the contributions of the great Chairman Mao into a coherent body of ideas and approaches. Maoism, what that became, certainly in the West, and it is to the West I principally refer to, like American Maoism, French Maoism, British Maoism, is just silly student nonsense. Because what does it actually mean? I mean, I've read and met some groups who declare that they are going to fight a protracted people's war in England, for instance, or in Britain. Now, if you know anything about Britain, there ain't much of a peasantry. You could argue you were going to fight some sort of guerrilla war, but frequently all Maoism collapses into in the Western world is like a fetishization of guerrilla struggle, or protracted people's war, as they would call it. They fall into one of the traps that Lenin always warned about, which is they become essentially just ultra-left dogmatists. And they go from some screaming for years and years that the only way is the protracted people's war way, that there's no other form of struggle to be considered. Anybody who considers anything else is a sellout and an opportunist. And frequently what these people do, as we've said a lot on this channel over the last year or so, is they go from screaming revolution, revolution, revolution to flipping right over into becoming right opportunists and basically saying, well, now we need to accept bourgeois democracy, and we'll stand in elections now, and we can forget revolution. Now, the connection between ultra-left dogmatism and opportunism is that neither really has any concept of, has any understanding of the centrality of the ongoing class struggle to the method of Marxism, and also to the revolutionary application of Marxist-Leninist theory. What the dogmatists seek to do is to essentially organize some sort of military action via small cliques, and what the right opportunists seek to do is to govern via bargains with the capitalist class, also on the basis of small cliques. And each thinks that they can substitute the struggle of the working class, and in some cases, depending upon the country, the peasantry, the struggle of the masses, and substitute it out for either a group of bureaucrats or a clique of isolated so-called professional revolutionaries. Now, so that Maoism in the West is just dogmatist nonsense most of the time. So, James Graham says Z to you. Terry says, I just had to make sure that I attended this broadcast. A great man, so easy to read and understand. Long live the legacy of Lenin, long live communism. Quite right so. And Banana Bender says, I've heard that the Shining Path in Peru is just a cult and doesn't do anything for workers and peasants there. I don't know enough about Sendero Luminoso, Shining Path, to comment. I've read some of what the pro-Maoist people say about them. I think that their later years, they definitely descended into becoming the cult of Gonzalo, Chairman Gonzalo, their long-time imprisoned leader. But I don't know enough about their war and their struggle to deliver a verdict that would be informed enough to stand up to scrutiny at the moment. I know bits, but not a lot. So I will comment on the Shining Path when I've done more reading on them, is my answer to your query there. HM says, what are your thoughts on the Black Panthers? Didn't they claim to be Maoists? Some claim to be Maoists. So they used to sell copies of Chairman Mao's Little Red Book in, was it Oakland that they were most active in back in the late 60s? Some of them claimed to be Maoists. Some of them were more radical black nationalists. I mean, it was a bit of a mixed bag to be honest. I mean, some of them, like Fred Hampton, were actual communists. Others, like Eldridge Cleaver, well, went from being sort of an ultra leftist black nationalist type to didn't he end up endorsing Ronald Reagan and like becoming like a Christian conservative after years in exile in Algeria. So Black Panthers, I mean, they had many members who were sincere revolutionaries. They had people in them who were complete opportunists. It was certainly a very important revolutionary organization that existed in the United States that everybody who was called themselves a communist at the time would have had to have had an orientation towards. They get picked apart, of course, and destroyed by the counterintelligence programs run by the FBI. But also, I think that even some of their former members would admit that they had a weakness when it comes to organization. I think they varied greatly in terms of the level of organization by chapter and also by some of the political lines that they took as well. They weren't really practitioners of the kind of democratic centralism I'm going to be talking about in just a moment. So their organization was sometimes rather loose. I don't think that they applied in some chapters particularly strict criteria as to who they recruited. And I don't think that they had like a candidate membership period to try people out, which made it the case that the FBI then went and rounded up loads of people, loads of black guys who were doing prison time, which of course was no shortage of them due to the way in which American so-called law enforcement actually works. And they would round them up and offer them a deal. Like the guy who assassinated Fred Hampton, he was offered essentially a deal by the FBI, which is, we'll keep you out of jail, we'll keep you out of trouble, if you agree to be our grass, you be our rat. And he was the guy who stitched up Fred Hampton for assassination by the FBI and the Chicago Police Department. And so they had a number of problems with their organization. It's still a great revolutionary organization. It's still one that clearly the American ruling class found threatening enough to make great efforts to crush. It still produced great American revolutionary leaders who were assassinated, like people like George Jackson, people who were dedicated communists who were in this sort of wider revolutionary and Marxist sometimes black nationalist organization. You get the great Fred Hampton, of course, who was active in places like Detroit. And so very fascinating organization that should be studied properly and not just reduced to a beret and a leather jacket, which is what, of course, bourgeois historiography reduces it down to. Right. Banana Bender says, I think the RAF in Germany may have been Maoist too, but they were definitely infiltrated and had provocateurs in their ranks. Yeah, Red Army faction. Interesting bunch. I mean, I have some sort of major books on them that I haven't got around to reading yet. I've read some of the critiques, some of the statements, I believe written mostly by Ulrich Meinhof. And to be fair, a lot of the things that they said about the West German state, the Federal Republic, which is still the state that exists today, was true. They were true, which is that it was a state dominated by US imperialism, built on a foundation of Nazi officials, and that they were pursuing their urban guerrilla campaigns to eliminate, to inspire revolution, to take military action against the fascist elements in the West German state and the US occupiers. So a lot of the things they said were true. Now, whether their tactics were particularly effective, that's another question. And they've been claimed by all kinds of people, including like anarchists. American anarchists seem to be rather keen on them for some reason. Perhaps there's some sort of connection to the Weathermen there. But certainly, I don't know if they were infiltrated in the early years, in their period in the 70s. I think they were definitely infiltrated in the much later years. I think that I think one of them certainly was had a relationship with the state. A guy called Horst Mahler, who went from being like a Marxist-Leninist to being a Nazi in about less than 5 years. I know that's happened before, but certainly that guy, given the level of infiltration and the level of direct state agents that effectively run German fascist organizations and have done for a very long time, the idea that somebody would go from being a Marxist-Leninist to being a fascist in Germany in the late 70s and the state not have some kind of involvement in that seems a little far-fetched to me. But let's get into the meat of the issue then, which is, of course, going to be talking a little bit about what is to be done by Lenin. This might end up being 2 episodes rather than 1, given the amount of time I'll need to go through this, but let's see. The book first comes out in 1902, which was following the establishment of Iskra, or the Spark newspaper, and Lenin was attempting to build up a national Marxist organization through the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. And this period, of course, coincides with the emergence of revisionism, what became known as revisionism or opportunism, in the Second International, rearing its head openly through the figures of people like Eduard Bernstein. Bernstein had been a long-term collaborator with Engels. He was a prominent leader in the German SPD, was very well trusted and well thought of. So it was, of course, with a great deal of authority that Bernstein came out and started saying things such as that there didn't need to be a revolution, that there would be an incremental path to socialism via the reforms that were already happening through the German Reichstag, and that the idea of revolution was outdated. And of course, Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg, were 2 of the most prominent opponents of his, as was Karl Kautsky at the time. But we all know what happened to him in the end. So this struggle between the revolutionary tendencies or the avowedly revolutionary tendencies in the Second International and the followers of Bernstein is the historical background and the intellectual background to the writing of what is to be done. And so Lenin, in writing this, is taking up a struggle against so-called gradualism or Bernsteinism or reformism, and that is one of his principal targets in writing this book, is that he wants to find a way to organize this nationwide party that he is in the basis of in the middle of trying to build at the time of writing, and to organize it in a fundamentally new way that would avoid the opportunist traps that other parties in Europe were already falling into, such as the French socialists, who were already led by some pretty dodgy characters who had already participated in bourgeois governments and compromised on every single principle in their platform. So this is why Lenin writes this. He writes this as part of an active struggle against the Bernsteinian wings of certainly the Russian movement. So it lays down the framework which would come to be refined by Lenin and others over the years, especially by Lenin, but he lays down the framework for the building of a revolutionary party that would come to full fruition, of course, during the revolution or revolutions of 1917, especially in the run-up to October. And I'm going to lay this out in 4 key parts as to what Lenin was getting across here. So, first part, and we've already mentioned this word before, but he talks about dogmatism and so-called freedom of criticism. Now, this is, of course, a big debate within Marxist and so-called Marxist organizations to this day. What Lenin demonstrates in this chapter, when he's talking about dogmatism and freedom of criticism, is how that by using the slogan of free speech, the opportunists were destroying the very premises and the aims of Marxism, and that these were now being denied by by the Bernstein advocates. Now, I'm going to read what will be the first of a number of quotes from Lenin himself. So in this chapter, Lenin says, the very conception, the ultimate aim, was declared to be unsound, and the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat was absolutely rejected. It was denied that there is any difference in principle between liberalism and socialism. The theory of the class struggle was rejected on the grounds that it could not be applied to a strictly democratic society, governed according to the will of the majority, etc. So what Lenin, of course, has realized and is talking about here is that they are the Bernstein elements, the open reformists, are essentially moving to a version of bourgeois liberalism. And what they wanted to reject, which is the same argument that would be advanced later, by the way, by Karl Kautsky himself after 1917, when he, of course, attacked the Bolshevik Revolution. The argument put forward is that, the dictatorship of the proletariat is not democratic. We must have the will of the majority on our side, and by that, what they means is what they mean by the will of the majority is that we must have 50% plus one of the population on our side before we can do anything. And of course, this is a moving away, as Lenin says, from the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's a masking, reformism masks the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie by pretending that political action should be constricted to bourgeois democratic channels. They mask the rule of the bourgeoisie when they pretend that what is possible is only attainable through bourgeois democratic channels. They don't explain to the revisionists and the reformists, don't explain to workers how the bourgeoisie exercises its power through its dictatorship, and the attainment of the votes by workers, which even though all communists have always stood for, if, as I've said before, if you get the vote, if you get yourself certain aspects of democratic rights or legal rights, civil rights, once that's been attained, much like getting a wage increase, the capitalist class will immediately look for ways to subvert that democratic right that you've just won. And even if you think you're going forward, they're already finding ways to turn you back again. And by insisting, as they did, that change was possible via bourgeois parliamentarism, what the revisionists at the time were doing, the reformists at the time were doing, was essentially disarming the working class. And you need to make clear, and Lenin said this over and over again, that bourgeois society is a bourgeois dictatorship, even with very, the dressing up of it that is done through so-called bourgeois democratic reforms. Even if the working class get a little bit out of that, it doesn't lessen the fact that there is a bourgeois dictatorship in place that's exercising its power via all manner of channels that aren't necessarily visible at any given time. And so Lenin would come back to this over and over again. If you reject the dictatorship of the proletariat, if you reject the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat, you are rejecting essentially all of Marxism. And if you fall into the trap of believing or embracing the idea, as Kautsky did, as Bernstein did, as revisionists much later on in the later 20th century would, that bourgeois democratic parliaments are more truly democratic than the Soviets and the Soviet system, the Workers' Council system, the Soviet system that was built through the Revolution of 1917, and the building up of the workers' state and embodied in the Stalin-era Constitution of 1936. Always and through that, you got these social democrats babbling on and whining that the bourgeois democracies, that the bourgeois parliaments were so much more democratic because you had a choice of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, however many you like, parties. To which any communist should simply reply, yes, you've got an infinite number of parties and one dictatorship that they're all defending. And that the working class gets to participate by voting once every 4 or 5 years or once every 2 years, and then is told to basically get back in your box again. Whereas Soviet democracy is based on and was based on the idea and the practice that the working class should be engaged on a permanent basis in the Soviets, in the building of the economic plans, the 5-year plans that would play this huge role in industrializing the country, and that the engagement of the masses with the democratic systems of the state and the party to a degree would be engaging in a far more democratic process, a process of proletarian democracy to shore up and to secure a proletarian dictatorship. The dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, expressed in its various different ways, reinforced by bourgeois parliamentarism. That is what the Social Democrats were actually supporting. For all the squeaking and crying about democracy, when the Bolsheviks did the entirely correct thing of getting rid of the Constituent Assembly, it revealed just who Kautsky really was, which is that he was a man who was an opportunist who fetishized bourgeois parliamentarism. So when it came to and one of the big controversies in this era was, of course, the idea of so-called freedom of criticism. Now, Lenin demonstrates that this new tendency of stating that freedom of criticism is the principle that should be considered over and above everything else. It didn't emerge spontaneously. Instead, it was transferred, as Lenin says, transferred bodily from bourgeois literature to socialist literature. And he's demonstrated in theory by Bernstein, who rejected the concept of class struggle and the inevitable world revolution, and was, of course, as I've said, the man who originated the theory of evolutionary socialism, or one of them, and expressed in practice, Lenin states, by Milleron. Now, Milleron was a leader of the French Socialist Party who joined a bourgeois cabinet and, again, did so on the basis of getting practically zero concessions and compromising on everything that the French party said that it agreed to. So, right opportunism, as Lenin observed, has a long history. And it's history in the early 20th century and its emergence into becoming into deadly effect in 1914 comes from, as Lenin states, that long period of relative social peace between 1870 and 1914, where you get the aristocracies of labor emerging in the imperialist countries and them coming to dominate the leadership of the Second International parties, and of course being tied more and more to their so-called their national bourgeoisie. So Lenin identifies where right opportunism grows out of, and then he goes on in this chapter to criticize the what's known as the League of Russian Social Democrats Abroad. And now this was an emigre organization that he had played a part in founding earlier on. So he spends some time in this chapter addressing what he sees as the emerging of a particular brand of Russian opportunism in this organization, and its inability to properly critique this emergence under the guise of securing unity between the different socialist factions in Russia. So what you notice is, when it comes to revisionism, is that one of the things that revisionist leaders, or like weak, compromising leaders and who run organizations, who are insistent upon unity between opportunists and revolutionaries, they are desperate never to confront the contradictions between revolutionary practice and opportunist practice. And the way in which Lenin expresses the problems with that form a very interesting basis for refuting a lot of the bourgeois lies about what Lenin actually stood for. So Lenin locates the theoretical turn in the League of Russian Social Democrats Abroad on the shoulders of the extensive participation of the academic stratum in the socialist movement in recent years, as he puts it. In other words, a lack of working class participation and a lack of a working class intelligentsia. The main issue in Russia are parties who are dominated by the reformists, or he also refers to them not just as reformists, but a lot of the time he calls them the economists. Reformist is the word I'll be using, who prefer to focus on the workers' immediate economic struggles and want to leave theoretical issues aside. So Lenin goes on to state, and I'll read this quote before discussing further, "The case of the Russian Social Democrats strikingly illustrates the fact, observed in the whole of Europe and long ago noted by the German Marxists, that the notorious freedom of criticism implies not the substitution of one theory over another, but freedom from any complete and thought-out theory. It implies eclecticism and the absence of principles." So Lenin always gets criticized, and his writing is misrepresented by bourgeois critics who said, he wants to impose a line on everybody and there's no freedom of criticism. And this was a line that was being used against him as early as 1902. Now, let's counterpose for a moment what Lenin's view of criticism and an inner party regime based on critiques and criticism of different lines, and what the opportunists both then and now like to put forward as their so-called freedom of criticism. So Lenin's point here is not that the differences should not be discussed. It is that they should be forced out into the open and clear critiques made. Now, Lenin criticizes the reformists and their allies who obscured the differences in this organization that he's criticizing, the League of Russian Social Democrats Abroad, and not being prepared to even properly defend their position. In the book, he criticizes them because he says that, their position keeps changing. It's not even clear what actual position that they hold. So his overall point is that the political practice shows that Lenin wanted to make sure that differences were exposed and debated, and the organizations in which these debates are being carried out has to risk splitting, because splitting might be necessary, rather than carrying on with too many opportunists in your ranks. See, the point isn't that you don't criticize or that you just impose a line, the leaders impose a line and that's it. That's never what Lenin argued, and it's never what Lenin practiced. In real terms, what Lenin was aiming to do in the theoretical work, what is to be done, and the practical way in which he tried to build the Bolshevik Party up to 1917 and then beyond, was that what he aimed to do was to get the differences between the opportunists and the revolutionaries out into the open in a disciplined inner party debate. Not what the opportunists at the time in the leadership of this organization he's criticizing wanted to do, which is to gloss over it all, pretend that the differences aren't there, find a line that everybody can live with and stick to that. Whereas Lenin's saying, no, the ignoring of these differences is going to be fatal. Pretending that you can remain in the same organization if you're a revolutionary, as people who don't just take a slightly different view to you on tactical questions such as when is it correct to stand for the bourgeois parliamentary process or in the bourgeois parliamentary process, and when is it more correct to look at things like general strikes and insurrections and attempts to seize power. If you've got people in your organization who are absolutely 100% dogmatically committed to just working through bourgeois channels no matter what, and you've got on the other hand a group of revolutionaries who are taking the more correct position, but you've got an irreconcilable group of opportunists in there, you can't find a common ground between them. You can't even, if you're going to adopt the approach that many have adopted, which is to pretend for the sake of unity, to find these forms of words that would cover up the differences. And this was demonstrated by the Second International before World War One, when they would make these big grand announcements about we're going to wage war against war, was one of their slogans. We're going to have a general strike against the war. And all these big phrases that were in actual fact covering up the fact that the opportunist tendencies were already so powerful, they were in charge of the largest and well-developed so-called Marxist parties, such as the German Social Democrats and the Austrians as well. And of course, then you've also got the British Labour Party in there, which was never a Marxist party to start with, but was always run by opportunists. But it's particularly the German SPD that was the fatal one, because that was a party run by people who claimed to be Marxists, people who claimed to be revolutionaries. And when it came down to it, they proved to be the opposite. And that circumstance had been allowed to grow because, of course, the leadership didn't want to have these debates. They didn't want to examine the big, grand-sounding slogans and speeches of the leaders. Whereas Lenin's point is the opposite. It's that there must be inside the party a vigorous critique of these slogans, of programs, of anything which doesn't pass the test of, are we taking the revolutionary cause forward? Are we bringing this to the workers? Are we advancing in terms of our influence in the working class? Or are we just spouting slogans, and are we tail-ending the working class? See, the other point that he's making consistently, and we'll come to this in just a moment, about tail-ending the masses rather than providing leadership for the masses, is that the reformists at the time said, oh, we will just follow. The spontaneity of the masses is our guide, whilst combining that at the same time with an opportunist approach to and a dogmatic approach to bourgeois legality and bourgeois parliamentarism, all covered up by this unwillingness to interrogate, this unwillingness to debate. And what Lenin got somewhat notorious for in the Russian revolutionary circles was the fact that he was a stickler for investigating problems, for looking for contradictions, for looking for things that didn't make sense, that contained opportunism within the party program, within the slogans advanced, within the articles in the newspaper, within the statements of leading members, and forcing a debate on these things and opening up this for interrogation to find where the political problems were. See, the actual reality of Lenin's political practice is the exact opposite of the way in which he is portrayed by his bourgeois critics and his moronic, opportunistic leftist critics who don't like him, presumably because they've either not read him or his criticisms remind them too much of themselves. So, Lenin, to sum up this particular section, is the opposite of what he is portrayed as by his bourgeois critics. He's a man who always sought to open up debates and was for the most rigorous examination of the party's practices, as long as it was done in a disciplined fashion. So, to come back to the point about democratic centralism, the democratic element and the centralist element are meant to be self-reinforcing around each other. So the democratic element means that you have this thoroughgoing examination of all the major points that the party needs to enact. And then the central element is that once that debate has been had, the conclusion has been reached, and the democratic process has been exhausted, once the decision has been made, then the party has to unify around that decision. What you find in a lot of opportunist organizations where there is no discipline, they combine a lack of democracy with the lack of any kind of centralism. And one of the ways you know very well that your opinion doesn't matter for shit in these organizations, be they Trotskyites or reformists, is that, yeah, they'll allow you to say anything you like, whenever you like, because the decision's already been made by a clique, and they have no interest in you other than as a seller of newspapers or a deliverer of leaflets. Every communist, in Lenin's mind, had a profound responsibility to educate themselves consistently, as we've already said, and bring themselves up to the theoretical level where they could critique the party's program and participate in these debates, and then were very much part of this collective decision that they would then own. You see, I've been part of plenty of organizations where they never imposed any kind of centralized discipline. They never stopped you from mouthing off about the organization, the party, anything. We could moan about anything you liked at any point because you weren't making decisions, and therefore they didn't care what you thought. That's certainly the case in social democratic parties. It's the case in plenty of Trotskyite parties. Freedom of criticism at all times and in all circumstances is basically a guarantee that anything you say isn't going to matter. Because if what you said did matter, then you would be, first of all, in a revolutionary party, what you say does matter, because the leadership, if it's a real revolutionary leadership, should actively want to have you contributing to inner party debates to be able to strengthen the party's line and strengthen the party's position. And therefore, because you've had ample opportunity to participate in it, it is then only correct that you are then bound by the decision and bound to carry it out. Because if the revolutionary party, a party which is struggling in capitalist society against the overwhelming power of the bourgeois dictatorship, if you don't have unity around your decisions and a disciplined enforcement of your decisions, then you don't have anything at all. So, moving on, and he starts bringing up the questions of spontaneity. So, next quote reads as follows: "We revolutionary social democrats," just as an addendum here, he will use the term social democrat in this period of his writing because he's talking about a period where social democrat didn't mean Bernie fucking Sanders or Jeremy fucking Corbyn. It meant basically communist. That's what it meant. It only started to mean reformist really after World War I and especially after World War II. So where he says social democrats in this work, in your mind, that should trigger the term communist. So I'll start again. "We revolutionary social democrats, on the contrary, are dissatisfied with this worshipping of spontaneity, worshipping what is at the present time. We demand that the tactics that have prevailed in recent years be changed. We declare that before we can unite, and in order that we may unite, we must first of all firmly and definitely draw lines of demarcation." So that's exactly what I've just been talking about there, that if unity does not and must not come through covering up differences, through masking differences, through pretending that you can be in the same organization as people who are the diametric opposite and don't even share the same aims as you anymore. And that must be brought out. And if you bring that out and you debate it properly, as Lenin is advocating for here, you can, of course, bring people back around to the revolutionary position, bring them back around to a principled Marxist-Leninist line. But if you can't, then have no fear of splitting with them. You should. People get terrified, particularly if they've been in an organization for a long time, of, well, we're going to lose this comrade, we're going to lose that comrade. Well, if they can't stand up to an inner party debate, and if they'll walk out if they're criticized, then these people are worthless. But this is what happened with the British Communist Party, by the way. Communist Party of Great Britain, as it used to be known. After they collapsed into revisionism in the 1950s, they started to take an extremely opportunist approach to recruiting, in that they would recruit people who were basically social democrats. They would have people who were prominent trade union officials in Britain inside their party, and then they would never criticize them. Well, because if we criticize them, they might leave, and we might lose our influence within the movement. And that's what happened to many of these parties. They were operating diametrically in the opposite way to what Lenin advocated for and what is to be done, and what Lenin practiced all of his life. Of course, they had their handy quotes that they bastardized from Lenin, often from left-wing communism and infantile disorder, but that's a book we'll be considering on another day. So he also quotes at this stage Marx to back up his point, and I'll read the Marx quote as well because it's worth looking at. "If you must combine," Marx wrote to the party leaders of the German SPD, then enter into agreements to satisfy the practical aims of the movement, but do not haggle over principles. Do not make concessions in theory. Without a revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. So, of course, what he means there, he's referring to the pre-formation period before the formation of the German SPD. And I believe that's from a letter to either Wilhelm Liebknecht or August Bebel. So what Marx is saying there is essentially, Lenin's using that quote to demonstrate his own point, which is that if you are going to enter into agreements to form a new party, as the SPD was to become, and as the Social Democrats in Germany were trying to work towards a unity there, the whole question of how you do it has to be one that's approached in a principled fashion. So you can unite with people, as Marx says in that quote, with the aim of, okay, well, this is going to take the working class movement as a whole forward. But if you abandon every single principle, and if you abandon revolutionary theory for the purposes of advancing the movement, then you haven't advanced the movement. What you've advanced is a dead end. So you've run straight down a dead end, which is what the German SPD ended up being. It took the movement forward for a little while, but in the end, by 1914, the German SPD was a barrier to change, because the revolutionary change, because the leaders ignored Marx's advice. I mean, Marx was screaming at them for years over the risks that were present within the SPD, famously in the Critique of the Gotha program. So, the main points from this chapter can be summed up as follows. That Lenin insists that when he's talking about the tactical alliances with the bourgeoisie in Russia, because this is another theme that he keeps coming back to. Now, there was at the time a very real debate in the RSDLP, Russian Social Democratic and Labour Party, about what to do with regard to a potential alliance with the liberal bourgeois, the constitutional bourgeois in Russia. Because there's, of course, the absolutist monarchy there that still dominates the political life in the country. So is it possible to make an alliance with the Russian bourgeoisie in order to pursue constitutional change, to possibly get rid of the monarchy, to reduce the influence of the Orthodox Church, which was dominant in Russia at the time, and to enable perhaps a more free way of the working class being able to organize under the terms of a Russian bourgeois democratic state. So Lenin insists that, and this is, bear in mind, this is 1902 that this is coming out, this is pre the 1905 revolution, that if there's any tactical alliance to be had with bourgeois forces that was aimed at pushing for a bourgeois republic within Russia, then this must not be a way of surrendering political leadership to the Russian bourgeois. That the working class in Russia must retain its own leadership, and therefore that leadership must educate the workers to the true nature of the Russian bourgeoisie. Therefore, immediate struggle against bourgeois forces would have to be launched as soon as the Tsardom fell. And this is exactly what was to occur, that as soon as the Tsardom falls in 1917, the struggle against the bourgeoisie begins immediately, because the bourgeoisie in Russia are absolutely desperate to bring the revolution to a close. They're desperate to shut things down, and Lenin, of course, foresees this and is able to respond accordingly by advancing powerfully from April 1917 the slogan of "All power to the Soviets, for an immediate peace and for land to the peasants," and peace, bread and land, as he later summed it up as. And Lenin goes on to further talking about leadership. Now, I'll read another quote from Engels in just a moment to back up Lenin's point that Lenin uses in the book. But the point is that if you attach yourself to the bourgeoisie and completely surrender working class political leadership to the bourgeoisie, as the Mensheviks, by the way, under people like Tsereteli and Fyodor Dan in 1917, what they aim to do is to completely give up the independent working class politics in 1917 and just basically deliver the working class bound and gagged to the bourgeoisie and say, right, that's it, lads, thanks very much for the uprising, never mind the people that died. Now we must surrender power to Pavel Milyakov of the Cadet Party and Guchkov of the Octoberists, because that's what Marx would have wanted. So what the Mensheviks and the other opportunists in Russia wanted to do was to remove the working class political leadership and essentially bind the working class to the Russian bourgeois. And this sadly has happened to disastrous effect on many different occasions throughout the 20th century, when the lessons that Lenin is teaching here were forgotten. Now, Lenin, when talking about leadership, goes on to quote extensively from Engels, and I will read this quote as well. "It is the specific duty of the leaders to gain an ever clearer insight into all theoretical questions, to free themselves more and more from the influence of traditional phrases inherited from the old conception of the world, and to constantly keep in mind that socialism, having become a science, must be pursued as a science, i.e., i.e., it must be studied. The task will be spread with increased enthusiasm among the masses of the workers, the ever clearer insight thus acquired to knit together ever more firmly the organization of both the party and the trade unions." So what he's saying there is that the ones who need to study perhaps the hardest of all are the leaders themselves. And again, this becomes terrifyingly relevant after 1953, when it becomes obvious that the opportunists personified in the wretched figure of Khrushchev not only hadn't studied but hadn't understood anything. They had a bunch of stock phrases in their in their minds, and they just retreated back to those when challenged. They pretended, Khrushchev and the others did, that there was no more struggle, that there was no more conflict to be had, and that everything could be glossed over. They made all the mistakes and fell into all the opportunist traps that Lenin warned about, that Lenin was critiquing in this section of the book that we've just gone through now. So it's remarkable that 40 years or 50 years after he wrote this, that in the Soviet Union itself, the same problems that confronted Lenin in the form of Bernsteinism were to return. And it comes down to what Lenin is quoting from Engels there, but it comes down to the fact that it was a catastrophic failure at leadership level. And it was a failure of, in part at least, there were other things going on. There were material forces that helped to generate opportunism, but opportunism was allowed to take root because the party fell into the very practices that Lenin is criticizing here. So we are now at 9 o'clock, so I'm going to pause for a few comments. So where are we now? We have got Orod Zeni Communismu. Hello, comrade. Revolutionary greetings from France, from a Polish communist worker. Well, revolutionary greetings right back to you. And this person follows up by saying, I also have English-speaking channel Rebirth of Communism, where you've done an interview with Jyoti Bra. Oh, excellent. And okay, you want to interview me as well? Well, just email me at. I'm going to put the email address in the comments box now. And so if anybody wants to email me at any point, you can do so on editor@marxengelsinstitute.org. So get in touch with me that way if you want. Good evening to Klavek, who's just joined us. And Steve Fred Johnson says, Soviet democracy is based on the Soviets, the 5-year plans, and the engagement of the masses through real proletarian democracy. And Steve is exactly correct in that. Banana Bender says, it's interesting that Ho Chi Minh founded the French Communist Party, but France never became communist, and yet Vietnam did. Well, it's interesting that Ho Chi Minh founded the French Communist Party and might have been its greatest ever leader, because after him it all went downhill. The French Communist Party, despite having a heroic history in World War II of leading the French resistance, and many of them, thousands of them dying as a result, being killed by the Nazis, they rapidly, again, they collapsed into the very opportunism that Lenin is criticizing, that we've just been talking about. And they ended up as they were little more than a social democratic organization by 1946-47. The revolutionaries had been sidelined, and the opportunists were in charge, and they ended up backing the French war on Algeria. Became a pro-imperialist force. Became an anti-revolutionary force. The failure of the uprisings of 1968, the workers' uprisings of 1968, is down to a large part the opportunist leaders of the Communist Party of France, who essentially sold out to de Gaulle in return for some reforms which barely lasted 10 years. So again, same problems keep coming up over and over again. Whereas, of course, Ho Chi Minh was the founder of the Vietnamese Communist Party, who defeated the French imperialists and the American imperialists. And the French Communist Party, by comparison, after its heroic period in World War II, became just another pathetic reformist outfit. And what you see now remaining is a sad remnant of that organization, whereas the Vietnamese are still there and building socialism in Vietnam. Rian says, that seems to be a common fear amongst communist organizations currently. Don't correct them when they hold objectively wrong ideas and go along with liberal ideals in order to keep the numbers up. Yeah, I mean, this is essentially the reason why you get stuff like gender ideology and like very, very liberal positions, as Lenin says, and what we've just been going through there, creeping in to the communist parties in various different places. They prioritize recruitment at all costs, wouldn't confront the liberal and opportunist ideas that their recruits came in with, wouldn't politically educate them, glossed over all their differences, and as a consequence of which they ended up in a mess. Many of them just collapsed into straight-up opportunism. Some masked their opportunism, like the Greek Communist Party, with very left-wing sounded phrases. But ultimately, they were led in the direction of collapse because of a refusal to do what Lenin is saying here, which is you have to not only confront the issue in a disciplined way, you have to thoroughly interrogate it. And then only by doing that can you come back to a point of unity when you've actually rooted out the source of the opportunism. And if that means breaking with opportunists, then so be it. You'll be stronger without them. Because if you try and, again, let's re-emphasize the point, because I'm going to bring this particular episode to a close here. If you go down the road of glossing over differences, as many have, of pretending that the circle can be squared, you know, that the open revisionism, that open opportunism can live in the same organization as revolutionary practice, and that the two can somehow get along with each other and remain in the same party, well, therein lies the path to collapse. Because this is indeed what happened to the CPSU. It is indeed what happened to all of the Western communist parties. They all succumbed to opportunism. And we're going to be talking more about that tomorrow. So I think what I'm going to do is I am going to leave it there for this evening. We've been doing about an hour there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do more on Lenin tomorrow. And we're going to finish off going through the presentation I've got to do here on what is to be done. I think it's very appropriate that the plans I had to do this in an hour have not materialized, and I think Lenin would approve of an in-depth discussion on party organisation running over 2 days rather than one. So I think that's a fitting tribute to the man. So I will now thank everybody who has contributed to the chat for this evening. Thank you for joining me on this, the centenary of what I'm going to call Lenin's immortality. And I hope that you will be joining me again tomorrow. It will be at the same time, same place. I probably won't do another half an hour of music to lead into it, but maybe I will. And yes, in answer to the question posed by Beans and others, there will be a communist playlists coming out very soon. So thank you to everybody who's joined me here tonight. I will conclude by simply saying this: Lenin lived, Lenin lives, Lenin will live. Thank you and good evening.